Good morning, I'm Wayward Worm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome back to the Stolen Land, episode 19, Against the Stag Lord. The penultimate day of reckoning, at least as far as the Greenbelt was concerned, was bright and clear. The Volso Expedition found a hill a few days before, and as soon as they saw it, they knew it was the Stag Lord's fort. It was an old ruin that sat on top of a flat-topped hill. A large section of the top of the hill was bare. The fort only took up a small portion of it overall. It seemed to be a ruined stone tower of some age, with 3 wooden watchtowers built around it, and surrounding the entire thing was a wooden palisade. The party had settled on a small dell not too far away from the fort. In fact, from the hill closer to the fort on the other side of their dell, they could keep watch over the fort. And keep watch they did. Primarily Lucian, who was seen as the most militarily inclined one of them. The night before they were going to make their assault on the fort, Lucian stayed watching the fort for as long as he could before calling them all for a meeting. I've watched the fort for several days now, and the bandits reveal more than they would imagine. For example, I know there's some sort of trap on the hillside around the fort. The road to the fort seems to be okay, but not the hill itself. Tiber stroked the scruff on his jawline. And why do you say there's something wrong with the hill? Because they ignore it. Every bandit I have seen do a watch only pays attention to the road. It was a little hard to tell at first, because the road winds around a good chunk of the hill, but it became clear first by seeing how much they ignored the parts of the hill that don't have the road on it, and then the rest was just paying attention to where their eyeline must be. For some reason, they believe the hillside itself does not require being watched. It might be hubris or lack of discipline, but with how much attention they pay to the road itself, I think that is unlikely. As far as I can tell, there are 11 bandits in total, so they're going to outnumber us almost 3 to 1. I have thought of various ways that we can try to even those odds, such as starting by engaging in an archery battle or something. But I think the best way is just for Tiber and myself to stand shoulder to shoulder with our shields in front of us and march up to the gates with Petra and Umbria using us as shields. It is inelegant, but this fight is going to be slaughter, not anything approaching a pitched battle. He looked at Umbria. Umbria, I think you should use as much offensive magic as you have. She shook her head. No. I'm going to keep mage armor so I can use that before we begin. Then I'm going to keep a knock spell. When we get up to the gate, I will knock it open. If we're going to sit and make a full frontal assault, then we need to make sure we can open the gate. Plus, there is the fact that the gate bursting open will be quite the intimidation that we will need after sitting there soaking their arrows for however long it takes us to get up the hill. They packed up their camp and left everything they could behind, concealing as best they could before setting out for the fort. Umbria cast her mage armor, and her and Petra got in close behind Lucian and Tiber as they started walking up the path up the hill. It wasn't long before the alarm was raised, and arrows started flying their way. Once they'd started up the hill, it took them 30 seconds to run the 300 feet up the path, with 3 archers firing at them the entire time. Not a single one of the 15 arrows that were fired managed to do anything other than harmlessly get deflected. As they closed in on the gate, Umbria peeked out between Tiber and Lucian's shoulders and pointed forward. She caused the gates to fly open, with the wood that was barring them shut harmlessly flying back into the fort. Arrayed in front of the group were 4 more bandits with their short swords out. The first one to react was a mean-looking guy, slim, with not much appearing to be going on in his eyes. He rushed at Lucian and swung his short sword. Somehow he managed to slide past Lucian's long sword and shield, stabbing right into the armpit. It was mostly luck that kept the attack from being much worse. The second one rushed at Tiber. Under his armor, he wore what appeared to be the clothes of a minstrel. He also managed to get past Tiber's defenses, this time finding a small gap around Tiber's waist. His attack also threatened to be much worse than it ended up being, while still being quite nasty. Tiber recovered his wits quick enough to attack back almost immediately. His scimitar slashed hard against the minstrel, cutting deep into his face. The man screamed, but held his ground. Petra looked around the situation, judging it before she made up her mind. Pulling out her hand axes, she swung it around behind the man attacking Lucian and started hacking at him. Both axes found purchase in the man's back. The next man strode forward, looking all the world like someone taking a stroll through a city park, to Umbria, and slashed at her with his short sword. She easily parried his sword with her staff. Umbria was not going to put up with his shit and shot 2 magic missiles into the man attacking her. Magic missiles never missed unless something very odd happened. And beyond that, with a space of only a couple of feet between them, there wasn't much room for her aim to be off. Both missiles impacted on his chest. The next bandit to move was an older-looking man with graying hair and an unruly beard. He ran to Petra and attacked her, although not taking advantage of his comrade who was currently trying to fight off both Petra and Lucian. She hooked his sword with her axe and almost wrenched it from his hands. She was fully prepared for him and was able to dedicate an axe to each of her 2 opponents, well on the defensive. Lucian let out a roar and struck the first man down. His sword went through the man in his armor as if it were paper. He then followed up that attack with a cutting swing that took down the minstrel who had been in front of Tiber. With just 2 swings of his sword, Lucian had started evening the odds. The archers had moved down from their watchtowers and had been threatening to overwhelm the party before this. The next bandit decided to stay back and use his bow as he watched his comrades getting hacked down. It was for the best that he stayed back. His smell was so repellent that it threatened to sicken anyone who got close. He shot an arrow at Tiber, who seemed to have the worst defenses. He seemed to have guessed right, as the arrow embedded itself deep into Tiber. The next bandit who made the sad choice to rush in was a man who was rotund, to say the least, and his clothes were stained with grease. He also attacked Tiber, who did not have anyone he was fighting at the moment, and he wasn't stupid enough to try and fight Lucian. Tiber was ready for him and easily pushed aside his attack with his shield. The last of the archers stayed in his watchtower and took a pot shot at Lucian. His aim was so far off that he had almost put an arrow into the back of one of the other bandits. Tiber pressed the attack on the greasy bandit attacking him, but his scimitar was blocked each step of the way. Petra hacked into the man attacking her, cutting him down. At this point, there were only 2 bandits who were left in close combat, one archer on the ground a short way away, and an archer who was still in one of the watchtowers. Umbria shot another 2 magic missiles into the man who was attacking her, and he collapsed in a heap in front of her, never to move again. And as such, the battle continued to turn in the party's favor. Lucian walked up behind the greasy bandit and struck at him with his longsword, cutting him down in a single stroke. He then looked at the fort itself and bellowed, "Stag Lord, I know you're in there. Come meet me on the field of battle." The archer on the ground fell back a bit more, almost disappearing into the fort itself, before loosing an arrow at Lucian. The arrow grazed Lucian's groin area, where the armor was the weakest, slicing into his inner thigh. The other archer shot down at Umbria, and he solidly hit her in the chest. She almost fell back from the surprise and the force of the arrow as it pushed its way through her force armor. At that point, there was a large commotion from inside the fort. It took several seconds to figure out what it was. It became clear as the owlbear came out of the interior of the fort and struck down the archer who had been slowly retreating into there. Tiber decided to take this moment to start healing himself. Most of his wounds closed up, and he seemed to be ready to get back at it, although not quite back to full. Petra reassessed the situation and pulled out her short bow. "Take care of the owlbear. I'll handle the archer." Her aim was mostly true, but it only seemed to skim his arm. It clearly hurt, but at this rate, she'd be at it for a while. Umbria shot a scorching ray at the owlbear, just managing to hit it. The ray singed the creature noticeably, but it was not enough to bring it down. Not that she expected it to be. Lucian calmly walked up to the creature and slashed at it. He cut it deep, and it roared in his face. It was clear that they were going to go toe-to-toe, but it wasn't exactly obvious who was going to come out on top. The archer refocused on Petra and shot at her, missing her as she ducked out of the way just in time. From inside the fort came shouts of, "Ox! Ox! We have intruders!" Popping out from one of the walkways on the second level was a well-muscled but lithe man who seemed to be wearing a mix of leather armor and lace. He flung a dagger at Tiber, who managed to catch the dagger with his shield. The owlbear then began its flurry of attacks on Lucian, who planted firmly and attempted to weather the attack. First was one claw that was met with his shield pushing it away. Then came the second claw, which he shoulder-checked in such a way that the claw couldn't connect with anything. Finally came a bite from its beak that clamped down on nothing but air. A very large man with the face of a child ran out from the second story of the ruined tower and jumped to the ground in front of Tiber, and with a large grin he swung his club at the surprised cleric. Tiber then instantly learned that this monster of a man hit like a boulder and almost staggered him. Tiber decided to see how hard he could hit back on this bandit of unusual size. He felt like he connected very well, and his scimitar drew a lot of blood, but it didn't even seem to faze the man. Petra continued her duel with the archer, this time with a much more solid hit. Umbria looked around and decided her best shot was to fire her magic missiles at the man fighting Tiber. The other two duels going on around her seemed to have her side pretty well controlling their fights. The first missile solidly hit, but the other one was almost a miss and didn't seem to do much. Lucian attacked again at the owlbear. This time he swung with all his might, hitting hard. Unfortunately, it was not enough to bring the giant creature down, at least not yet. It seemed to slow by this point, its wounds starting to get the better of it, but not enough to change the battle much. A well-armored bandit strode out of the second level at this point, from some part inside the fort. He was standing right behind the other bandit up there who had thrown the dagger at Tiber, when suddenly he plunged his sword into the other bandit's back. He pulled the sword out as the other bandit swung around in shock. The armored bandit reached up and pulled the chain off of his neck and threw it to the ground. "I'm sick of this shit. I'm sick of you, Dovan." As he was saying this, the archer dueling with Petra loosed another arrow, hitting her in the side as the arrow tore through her skin and armor. The bandit, apparently named Dovan, smiled at his traitorous companion. Well, I was right about you, Akaros. I've been trying to find a reason to kill you, and here you are giving me one." With that, he pulled out a rapier and adopted a fencing style, and thrust at Akaros, who managed to turn aside his blade at the last moment with his shield. The owlbear continued its attack on Lucian, who was again ready to wither the attacks. This time he did not weather them as well. Both claws sunk into him, but he did manage to avoid the beak, as well as preventing it from getting a good hold on him. The large bandit swung again at Tiber with his club that was studded with nails. Once again, he hit hard, and Tiber spit out blood, knowing he could not take much more punishment from this bandit. Tiber quickly considered his options and ended up deciding that healing himself again was probably the best option. He felt like where he was at, he would go down on the next hit from this bandit, and he did not have faith that he would be able to take the man down first. After the spell was cast, he was pretty sure he could take 1 or 2 more hits before he was back in the same amount of danger. Petra fired another arrow at the archer. This time her arrow sunk into his neck and he collapsed unmoving. Umbria had a decision to make. She wanted to continue helping Tiber, but she saw how bad the owlbear was doing, and decided the best way for her to help would be to finish the owlbear, freeing up Lucian so he could join the fight with Tiber. So that's what she did, sending 2 magic missiles at the creature. With a final roar, the owlbear died. Lucian realized what Umbria's plan was, and rushed over to help Tiber. With a mighty swing, he cut deep into the bandit's back, slicing deep. The man almost fell forward under the unexpected assault, and turned around to face the new attacker. Akaros and Dovin continued their fight on the walkway. Akaros cut Dovin down where he stood. Ox swung his mighty club at Lucian, making a solid connection. With how powerful the swings were, both Lucian and Tiber were finding it hard to block the club. With his hit, he almost brought Lucian down. Tiber decided the best course of action was to heal Lucian, and so he did, closing up most of Lucian's wounds, or at least enough. Petra fired an arrow at the large man, but did not hit him as she was quite worried about hitting either Tiber or Lucian. At this point, Akaros walked over to the giant man and put him out of his misery. Or at least, that is what he would describe what he did in the future. With a momentary respite, Tiber healed his leader one more time, bringing him back. At this point, the Stag Lord finally appeared. He was clearly drunk, or at least majorly hungover. Aiming at Lucian, he fired 2 arrows. Only the first one hit, but in a single attack, he wiped out all the healing Tiber had done with the second spell he had cast on Lucian. Tiber shook his head at this. "Oh, buddy, you made a mistake coming out here with your bow. If you had come on the ground level sword in hand, maybe you could have had a one-on-one fight with Lucian, but taking the coward's way out, you have no hope of that." With that, he fired a flaming bolt at the Stag Lord from his crossbow. The bolt hit, but it was very clear that the Stag Lord would not be an easy target. Petra then fired her bow at the Stag Lord. He watched impassively as he casually stepped aside. At least, it seemed impassive. The man's face was covered by a helmet that looked like the skull of a deer with giant carnivorous teeth. Umbria shot her second scorching ray at him. She had been saving it for just this moment. She hit with the ray, which caused his armor to start smoldering. Lucian then headed up to the second story of the fort to engage the Stag Lord in melee combat. Akaros simply looked around and said, "As much as I reject the Stag Lord and everything he stands for, I cannot take up arms against him." The Stag Lord did not seem to have the same compunction as he shot 2 arrows at Akaros, both of which missed. Tiber fired one more time with his flaming bolts, again hitting, but only by the narrowest of margins. Petra fired another arrow at him, again missing. Umbria fired her last set of magic missiles at the Stag Lord. By this point, she was almost completely out of magic. Then Lucian made it to the Stag Lord, swinging hard with his sword, slicing deep into the oddly silent man. In a clear sign that he was losing, the Stag Lord drank a potion. Tiber, knowing his luck with the flaming bolts was probably at its limit, plus his supply of them was almost out, he decided to rush up to join the 2 in melee combat. Petra tried a third time to hit the wily bandit lord, again missing. Umbria shot a ball of acid at him. The acid hit on his shoulder and seemed to do about as little as it could without missing. Lucian decided to keep up the pressure and attack just as he had before, driving the Stag Lord before him. Again, the Stag Lord had to take a potion to keep himself in the fight. As he was retreating from Lucian, he was driven right into Tiber's waiting arms. Tiber slashed at him with his scimitar. The Stag Lord must have somehow known that Tiber was there, because he blocked Tiber's scimitar with his own longsword without even looking back. Petra decided the best course of action was to continue trying to fire into the melee. This time her aim was so bad that the arrow accidentally pinged off Lucian's shield. Umbria fired another bolt of acid at the Stag Lord, again hitting, but again doing almost nothing. Lucian kept up his relentless attacks against his foe, this time plunging deep into his belly, and slicing up Lord. The Stag Lord died. Thank you so much for listening to The Stolen Land, episode 19. This is where several years of writing have brought us to. The Stag Lord is dead. I started the story about 2 years ago. There's one episode left that will be going up next week. Episode 20, entitled Cleanup. Please tune in for that episode, and thank you so much for watching.